I have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Songbae, who is the Ag Finance Team Lead for USAID, who will moderate the next panel, which is the Global Development Community Perspective, adapting existing and new investments in response to the war in Ukraine. Over to you, Songbae.
Thank you. And can you hear me okay, Frank? Okay, great. Thanks, Songbae Lee. I'm based in DC.
Yes, very well.
Great. I'm the Ag Finance Team Lead. I have my colleague Hans also on the phone. The two of us are the Ag Finance team at USAID. Great to be participating today. It's you still will have a break.
Songbae,
right?
actually, you know.
Sorry, I'm breaking up. I see you're frozen, Frank.
Frank's breaking up.
Okay. I'll just say you will have a break after this panel. And actually, I had asked to move the break to the beginning before my panel because I got called on another call to discuss this same very topic, USAID's response to Ukraine and how we should spend our money. So that's something I will try to bring into this call, but really want to focus on our panelists. I am going to briefly introduce them and then ask them to maybe talk about their organization a little bit. I'm not familiar with all of them. I know some of them, they're still hard to understand. They're large organizations. So I'm just making sure I can see everyone. So there's Thouraya. I see. Oh, hi, Thouraya. Great. And Nabil. Is Nabil? I see Nabil and Leonard. Okay, so just briefly, I'll start with Thouraya. So worked, I think, very interestingly at the African Development Bank, now at IFAD. I got to meet her in person once in New York City when they were talking about the private sector, their new private sector financing activity. But I was wondering if, so to start out with introductions, can you talk a little bit about what IFAD does? And to make it a little more specific, do you guys give grants, debt? Who do you give it to? Do you give it to companies in the private sector? Do you give it to governments? Maybe just high level, but a little bit specific, and then what your role is there.
Thank you very much, Songbae. And the question you asked me, actually, I can spend the entire panel explaining what IFAD does, but let me try to be concise. First, I would like to thank you for the invitation to join this exciting panel. So my name is Thouraya Triki. What I do there, I'm the director of the technical division called Sustainable Production Market and Institution. It took me 3 years to learn the name of my division when I joined IFAD. What does IFAD do, and what is IFAD? IFAD is what we call an international financial institution and the UN specialized agency. We were created in the 70s to address a food crisis. So we are extremely relevant to the current context. Our business model is very simple. We raise money through replenishment cycle every 3 years, mainly from member states. And we deploy it in the form of mainly concessional loans to government to support public sector investment projects that are targeting and focusing on a very specific niche within agriculture, which are small producer and rural poor involved in food systems. Our priority is to help them improve their production, productivity, strengthen their benefits from market participation, and their resilience to climate change. For 40 years, we've been providing mainly sovereign loans at mainly concessional, with a priority low-income country, low-middle-income country, as well as a grant. Since 3 years, we are able to also fund directly private sector entities whose business model provides services and benefits to small producer and rural poor, and we can offer debt, equity, risk sharing, mainly in hard currency. We have a high risk, low return appetite, and that's the niche that in which we positioned our private sector financing program, because we wanted to be additional complementary to all the great programs and initiatives supported by other donors. Thank you. Over to you.
That was very impressive, Thouraya. And I even have a better understanding now of your organization. One just direct question, specific. You call yourself an IFI, International Finance Institution. Do you just call yourself, would you call yourself also a DFI or an MDB? Or do you really make a distinction between a multilateral development bank or a development financial institution?
Okay, so very easy question. What we are not is an MDB, because we are not a bank. We have been created as a fund. So that means that we do not have the capital like the World Bank or the African Development Bank. So our balance sheet, as I said, our resources come through mainly from what we call the replenishment, which is then deployed in the form what we call performance-based allocations to individual countries. You can, of course, call us a DFI because actually everything we do is about development. IFAD has a very high impact agenda and mandate. As I said, we focus on the poorest, on the rural smallholders, on rural poor. And actually that's what makes us different from other DFIs, that targeting is very strong in IFAD. In the sense that we do not go to a place and then we start counting beneficiaries. We identify where the poor are, and then we design interventions around them to lift them out of poverty and improve their situation. So yes, I would say IFI, DFI, we are multilateral, so we're not a bilateral, but we are not a bank. We're a fund.
It's, I think, these terms get a little in the weeds. Like I was just asked, what can we do with MDBs? And are they sure they know what they're asking me? Because I did not know if they're asking me about the World Bank, about the African Development Bank, or the DFC. Okay, so thank you for that. So the next one, this is an organization I'm really glad, Nabil, that you're on here to talk about, because it's one I'm not so familiar with. Being, working in the U.S., I mainly work with European DFIs, the African Development Bank, but the Islamic Development Bank. So Nabil, similar to Thouraya, started out his career in academia. And just one thing, a little background I thought was interesting, Nabil and Thouraya got their PhD at the same time at the same place. So they know each other well. I only met Nabil on the prep call for this webinar last week. So same question to you, Nabil. If you could kind of talk about it. One other thing I would say, I should have said it before Thouraya mentioned, you do not need to use the correct term for your position, because that's just usually confusing, right? I mean, so USAID, I work in the Bureau. Technically, it's called the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. I just call it the Ag Bureau. I mean, people don't like it, but if I just want to explain what we do, I just say we're the Ag Bureau. So I think I can put in the chat your titles, or I think your titles in the webinar announcement. So you don't need to use, you can use more descriptive and informative words when you try to describe the different departments of your group. Okay, Nabil.
Thank you very much, Songbae. Thank you for having me with you on this panel. We are not as relevant as IFAD to this panel, but we will try to basically present to you concisely what is ISDB and what we do, and especially what is our link with agriculture, with the food security, and all the efforts deployed by the international community as we speak. The Islamic Development Bank, we call it ISDB, was established almost 50 years ago. And we have, as we speak today, 57 member countries. All of them are members of the organization of OIC. And all of them also are from the South. So this is a very South-South cooperation institution by excellence. And we are an MDB. We are a multilateral development bank. Later on, ISDB established different entities, basically to propose a full-fledged multilateral financial services to the OIC member countries. Basically, we established ICD, which is our private sector arm. We established ITFC, our trade finance arm, the ISEC, our insurance of investment and export credit arm, and recently, last but not least, since 2007, we established ISFD, our poverty alleviation arm, with a capital of $10 billion. Now, when it comes to the economic empowerment department, the department I'm heading within the bank, it's like the one-stop shop for poverty alleviation, for the economic empowerment, for job creation, for vulnerable populations in our member countries. And basically, this department was built based on more than 20 years of experience of the bank in access to finance and financial inclusion, in economic empowerment, and all these similar fields. How we do our work, basically, we are four main functions. We design and we structure impact investment funds, whether we take the lead on that or basically we invest in existing funds. And we have excellent collaboration with IFAD so far. Also, we have a second function in charge of extending line of financing to financial institutions, and this line of finance are all backed by a kind of TA, and then sometimes by a kind of guarantee facilities. And the main idea is basically to target the bottom of the pyramid using the economic empowerment approach of ISDB, as I said, developed over 20 years of experience. And also we do, this is the non-sovereign part. The sovereign part, we design programs, sovereign programs with the governments. And these sovereign programs basically, again, are meant to serve the bottom of the pyramid, the economic pyramid, the vulnerable enterprise, the vulnerable categories. So we are very, very specific when it comes to this mandate. And we have a fourth very, very important function, which is called SEED, Solution Engineering and Entrepreneurship Design. And we design and engineer solutions, and we provide advisory capacity development in the area of economic empowerment to support all types of intervention that I have just mentioned. And we have a lot of synergies with the different other entities in the group, and we also work in full collaboration with the different other players from the private sector, for the government, the MDBs, sister MDBs, the philanthropists, and so on and so forth. So this is in a nutshell, a concise and brief presentation on ISDB, Songbae.
Okay, Nabil, thank you for that. And I know we're getting short on time. And to Leonard, I do not want to cut your chance. You're actually the person I haven't met I was most interested in hearing from. But I'm going to just cut to the question and then let you introduce yourself and go right into the question. But this is the question everyone will just answer, the main topic, and then I'll follow up if we have time with more specific questions. But so the question is, what is your organization doing in response to Ukraine? And I think, what is it doing? And I guess on top of that, I'll just add, like, how did it decide what is the priority? Because I just take the example that I was listening to the SMEs, like financing for agri SMEs was always hard, but it's just more necessary now. So do we keep doing what we're doing, or do we shift because of this crisis makes us focus on a completely different sector or an adjacent sector? So if you could talk about that, I think that'd be really interesting, what you're doing and how you decided that. And Leonard, I'll start with you, and please give us a brief introduction of if possible, of the European Union. It says EU. I thought you were with the European Commission. I always get confused between the two, but Leonard, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Songbae, and thanks both to Nabil and Thouraya. I actually were together with Thouraya in IFAD. So my first definition of what the EU, we are part of the Commission services. We are like a service provider to our member states. We are the guardian of the treaty. So we work in close collaboration with our 27 member states. I come, like you are, Songbae, the AG of USAID. I am the AG of DG International Partnerships, which is like one Directorate-General within the European Commission. It's in the RELEX family, the external relations of the Commission, and together with the RELEX family, like neighborhood being neighborhood to the European Union, like Southern Mediterranean or Eastern flank, Eastern neighborhood, like Moldova or Georgia or Ukraine. We have an instrument which is called the Neighborhood International Development Instrument, which is indeed a global Europe. It's an 80 billion portfolio, and of that, there is a component, and I will explain, for food security, including social protection. So, for example, as you said, we were already in dire straits before the war. COVID created havoc. There was COVID logistic bottlenecks already in December, in January of this year, then war struck. So this is a compounding of complexities. We had a number of instruments, not only grants, blending and guarantees. So the first question is, we have gone through a massive, I would say, repurposing, refocusing, front-loading of programming, because the 80 billion portfolio is 21-27. It was already logged in December 2021. And for EU27 and the Commission to unravel this 3 months later, it proved to be almost an impossible task. So first thing, we have seen what needs to be sort of front-loaded, meaning programs due in 23-24 to be programmed in 22 and 23. There will be a midterm review in 24, meaning that there could be a reconsideration of focusing more on food security. Why? Because it was already agreed that the tranches would be subdivided in 3 main headings. So around green, meaning energy, biodiversity, food, around 30-35%. Human development, which is education and health, 20%. one has to recall that COVID, vaccines, vaccine manufacturing was the big priority in 2021 and still is a priority. For example, strategic autonomy on vaccines, and then migration, and then gender mainstreaming of 85% of our portfolio. So we calculate that at the moment we have around 4.4 billion in terms of grants. We have a big portfolio, including a 40 million portfolio on one of our blending facilities, which is the ABC Fund. We have two other blending instruments, which are the ATIF and the Huruma Fund with the Spanish, Cofidis and ACID. And then we have Agri-Food. So we have a number of instruments between grants, blending, and guarantees. And on the 12th of July, we hope to receive proposals regarding our portfolio for agri-food, biodiversity, water, and forests. So the question now is all this fit for purpose as at July 2022? We still receive the same problems. De-risking agri-investments is difficult. It will be proving even more difficult when we have high debt, stagflation. I heard a lot of participants mentioning this. There is a lot of money out there. There are trillions and billions of funds. The question is, are these funds going to be channeled in small farm holders and typology of investments? So one final message before you can elaborate more. The European Union is not going to go back on its credentials of a green recovery process. Meaning, I saw in the chat, agroecology for us is very important. I heard issues around soil mapping, around digital technology, biodiversity, climate change. If we really want to have transformative food systems which are resilient, we need to move and depart from the past. Otherwise, it will not work to really be transformative also to what we decided a year ago in the UN Food System Summit. And this is what we want to prioritize. We hope that there will be those, even through agroecology, this is not going to be easy, that they will get a fairer price, a more inclusive price, but also a price which regenerates also the productive capacity. And I think an event like this with the Islamic Development Bank, with IFAD, with USAID, we need to get all our brains together to coordinate more. There is still lack of coordination. I know there is an IFI action plan, fine, but is this enough? We have had G7 in Elmau recently, fine. We have lots of activity of the public development banks, but are we having a coordinated, concerted effort at country level? Because what I hear are still major bottlenecks between the finance, the bankability, and smart policies. In an hour's time, FAO will launch the SOFI report 2022, and the team is repurposing public policy. If we want bankability, we need smart policies. Without smart policies, there won't be bankable projects. So this is something that needs to be also factored into the debate. Otherwise, you will not find bankable projects in scale towards those ticket sizes, which are in the 200,000, 1 million, 2 million range, especially.
Thank you, Leonard. And the collaboration, the coordination, I think that's the next piece I wanted to talk about if we have time after this round. I'm going to move to Thouraya. I just want to specifically ask Thouraya if you're going to talk about the crisis response initiative or not. Was that what you're planning on talking about? That I'll just say that I first read about it because it's listed in the White House press release that we would be supporting. But please let us know what what you see as being IFAD's kind of pivot, if they've made the pivot, and where they're focusing their priorities because of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Songbae. I would definitely mention the CRI, but I wanted also to build a little bit on the very good points made by Leonard, because I mean, we've been talking a lot. I think we end up sharing the same vision. So one important message that Leonard passed is that the situation with access to finance, which we are discussing today, has been already very difficult before the crisis, right? I mean, even before COVID, we know from the ISF figures that only 34% of the funding needs of agri-SMEs operating in the food systems in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia alone face a funding gap or an unmet need of $106 billion. In the climate space, it's even worse. We don't have exact figures, but what we know from an IFAD study that was done about a year ago is that only 1.7% of the climate finance goes to smallholders. So in my view, the situation will not be very different for MSMEs who are serving and working with them. So, and we should be honest about the challenges. There are supply, demand, and enabling environment issues. We know that these SMEs are high risk, low return, they have poor capacity, the policies that Leonard mentioned about, the lack of financial infrastructure, credit bureaus, and systems, etc. So these are things that we know in the past, and they are not new. COVID and now the Ukraine situation are making it more difficult. Why? Because one, they're driving.
Oh, I think you're.
No, I muted myself. I don't know what. Yeah. So that made actually the cost of producing, transporting, processing food more costly because the cost of fuel, of fertilizers, and energy and input is going up, right? So, of course, because of the heightened uncertainty, inflation, the higher default rate that could be triggered by these higher prices, we will probably see a rationing of credit, which makes it financing from banks less available, and then make it more difficult for non-bank financial institutions to get refinancing. So what are we doing in IFAD? One, I would like to remind everybody that IFAD, and I think I said it in the beginning of my intervention, our focus has always been on agriculture and smallholders and rural poor. And one message that we want to pass, that whatever we do currently, we need to keep the smallholders and the rural poor and the MSMEs working with them at the center. And so do we need also to push for the climate agenda. It's not because we have a war that we need to forget about the climate. And I think Leonard also emphasizes this very important point. What does it mean? It means that we need to provide financing that is counter-cyclical, because currently we are in a crisis response. We need to work on policies, and I agree with him on coordination. These are the three things. In terms of financing, we need different forms of financing, and we need to make sure that we don't get into the trap of the one-size-fits-all, because not all SMEs are affected the same. Those operating in cocoa and coffee actually will have an opportunity coming from the crisis. So, but at the same time, we know also that the most hit are Middle Eastern SMEs, Africa, and Southeast Asia. So let's not have a one-size approach and really make sure that we differentiate our offering. That's one. Second, my concern is that we are seeing a growing interest. Everybody feels that they have to do something about it, and that's leading to a lot of initiatives that are being thrown. Someone actually told me from the World Bank, so I did not check the figures, but I'm going to repeat them, that there are about 13,000 initiatives with an average size of 500,000. That's the fragmentation, the lack of coordination that Leonard mentioned. It's very important that we coordinate. Coordinate means that we should not stop an action plan where it's nice to say, oh, we will do this thing. We need to concretely align our planning and our intervention calendars. And that means that at the country level, we need to speak, plan together, at least for the big players and the multiple IFAs. What is IFAD doing? So we do have what we call a program of loan and grant that is targeting actually increased production, benefits for smallholders, and resilience to climate change of 3.5 billion, roughly between now and 2025. This is not humanitarian because we are not in the business of humanitarian activity, but it's really focusing on the long-term issues because we need to address these problems that are hindering food production and that would lead to improved food security. In addition, so this program is actually comprises a wide range of activities. We do a lot of rural financial programs, but at the same time, we do also capacity building because we need more bankable projects. We need aggregation. The issue of cost, it's not cost efficient to work with small entities. So you need to aggregate. We work on de-risking. And I want here to hint to the fact that in the case of small producer and report, it's not an issue of de-risking. I've been sitting in a lot of meetings where we talk about de-risking. It's important, but it's not sufficient. For these category, the returns are very small. So in addition to the risking, we need to boost the return for the investors. Otherwise, private investor will not come. So one option would be to say work with donors' money, maybe not on grants, but work with other forms. Or if we want the private sector to come and invest, we need to get the risk return profile right. And that doesn't mean only the risking. We have also launched our crisis response initiative, which is focusing on a smaller set of countries that are the hardest hit, which will have very limited fiscal space in order to operate. And of course, we're trying to scale up our private sector intervention. IFAD launched its private sector financing program in 2020. We positioned the program in a very underserved niche today by the market, which is the high risk, low return that I was mentioning earlier. We are actually we are very, very keen to to attract additional financing that we can deploy in order to provide countercyclical financing to SMEs, financial intermediaries, or other players who are working with the smallholders and rural poor in order to provide what I mentioned as the countercyclical financing. In addition, we are also very active on the global agenda through some key initiatives like the FARM initiated by the EU Council Presidency, which is held by France, or the GAS that is launched by Germany. I think both initiatives have an emphasis on coordination, but also on the fact that we should not lose track of the long-term challenges of the climate in order to address the access to finance and cope with the crisis. So I like Leonard, things like agroecology, sustainable production, inclusive and sustainable intervention are extremely important, and we need to ensure that whatever we do does not leave these topics behind. Thank you, over.
Thank you, Thouraya. I think, just one point I wanted to just highlight, you just said about aggregating and de-risking. And that is exactly what I was talking about doing on the call right before I joined here. The one thing I would maybe differ is that you were talking, and a lot of people say proud in the private sector. I'm not even thinking about the private sector. I'm thinking about aggregating and de-risking for DFIs. I just think for me, that's my focus, and the private sector definitely, hopefully, will come in later. Nabil, I'd like to give you a chance just to talk about ISDB's kind of response, or what has changed or not because of the current crisis.
Yes, this is a very, very important question, but it's important also to mention in the beginning that micro, small, medium enterprise represent for our member countries more than 90% of registered business and 50% of the employment, and contribute by up to 40% of their GDPs. And more interestingly, the average number of MSMEs per 1,000 people in our 57 member countries alone represent more than a double of the world average. And most of this MSMEs are in agriculture-related and agribusiness sectors, and this is very, very relevant and makes our responsibility even bigger during this crisis. Most of our member countries are at the heart of the crisis, and as we speak, around 152 million people currently facing severe food insecurity, and we are talking about 30 member countries almost in serious crisis, and they are facing serious issues in this field. So ISDB simply on the top of the huge program that we launched during the pandemic, and the sub-programs aiming basically to strengthen the economic resilience of vulnerable enterprise and populations we are heading. As we speak today, we are trying to realign our 10-year strategy with three main pillars. Number one, we will work hard on boosting recovery. And number two, we will tackle poverty and building resilience of our member countries. And three, very importantly, is to drive green economic growth with a special focus on nutrition, on food security, on MSMEs and job creation. So as we speak, even the strategy of the bank has been realigned to be able to respond to this crisis and to be able to help the member countries to address these challenges. Last year only, the bank approved around 300 million for the agricultural projects. We are supporting irrigation schemes. We are supporting agro-industrial processing zones. We are supporting agricultural enterprise development. And this comes to tackle the various challenges, including the low crop yields, as you know, the high post-harvest losses, and the low value addition in the agriculture sector. Group-wide, as we speak, the agriculture sector is the second highest recipient of the group net financing, with a total envelope of 2 billion in 1 year time. So these are one of some of the actions that show that ISDB is giving the right attention and is really considering and taking this matter very seriously. In terms of economic empowerment interventions, we are working on a good number of initiatives. We are launching impact investment funds in a good number of countries. As I said before, we can launch country-focused funds or regional funds. So we launched funds in Palestine, in Uzbekistan, in Libya. We are trying to participate in the APC fund launched by or sponsored by IFAD. Also, we have different initiatives with sovereign funds in the region to basically launch regional funds for food security. So we do that as well on the top of working on extending value chain oriented no-sovereign line of financing. This is basically, we do that with the financial institution and with the NGOs implement on the ground, basically to increase the outreach and to be able to serve the vulnerable populations in a very efficient manner. On the top of that, recently the bank, in collaboration with the Arab Coordination Group, we have announced the food security action package of a minimum amount of $10 billion to cover import costs of basic commodities, seeds, fertilizers in our member countries. And this specific intervention of the ISDB group should be detailed in our food insecurity response program, which is under review and will be submitted to our board very soon, hopefully by next month. So this is in a nutshell what we do to basically help our member countries to tackle this food security issue.
Thank you, Nabil. I think we're at time, but I think they gave me 5 more minutes. And so I'll just throw out one general question that I just was curious if anyone can respond. And this is, we're talking about finance, we're talking about agri-SMEs, but the interesting thing for me is this is an emergency. Is finance the right thing? You know, the first funding I think a lot of our organizations gave for it was the humanitarian response. We're still in this emergency situation. So the example I would ask is fertilizer. We're having a discussion. Should we be providing more finance for fertilizer, or should we just be subsidizing directly and buying down the price? Because we need this. It doesn't matter about the financing if the cost is just too high and they can't afford it. And I just think it's interesting, like in the US, when we had the COVID crisis, they didn't say, they just sent everyone checks. I got a check. They didn't say, give me a loan, right? They just gave me a check. So I know there's just obviously the resource question, but I'm just wondering, and are we focused too much on finance? Because that's what we do, finance. We're a hammer looking for a nail. Is that appropriate in this situation still? Can it be done effectively?
Songbae, look, you mentioned fertilizers, which is a big problem. So first question, and this was also raised by Nabil, if we want to accompany countries, first of all, we need all hands on deck, including our humanitarian partners. I didn't even mention the portfolio of DG ECHO, which are our humanitarian colleagues. On average, 0.5 billion every year is being earmarked. So that is a priority. Finance is always going to be an issue and it needs to be addressed. The question is, what typology of finance? Now, you mentioned the fertilizer. First of all, pushing synthetic fertilizers on its own will not do the trick. We know this. It has to be accompanied by soil maps, by smart agricultural practices. The question the international community needs to ask is, do we have an open check for massive, unsmart input subsidies? I don't think the community affords this unless we put everyone around the table, including the IMF, to speak about how special drawing rights and the big firepower, the 600 billion that was agreed last year, will actually trickle down at country level. We need to speak facts. How are we going to help Sri Lanka? How are we going to help Uzbekistan? How are we going to help Laos between the indebtedness on smart subsidies, green recovery, and tick all the boxes? It's not going to be easy because everyone has different agendas. The question is, what is the right agenda which makes a global recovery without shocks? And different partners will play a different game. We know that. But that is why there is an urgent need for coordination. Because if everyone pushes in totally different directions, we will not have a sustainable, inclusive recovery process, which we will come. Stop, break approach. Every crisis, there is a problem. Every 3, 5, 10 years, there is a major problem. So I think it's important that there is a common understanding of what we want to do in the country specifics, but also with strong buy-in and strong coordination. I can't insist more. At the moment, we are trying to have coordination, but there is not sufficient coordination on the ground. We're being pulled and pushed from all different directions in not a systemic way, including on the issue of inputs, including on the issue of climate finance, including on inclusiveness. Because, for example, if you have bad governance of input subsidies, it will be the big operators who don't need the subsidies who will benefit and not the smaller ones. So if you don't have that holistic approach, then you will just write checks and it might not have the long-term effect that you want.
Thank you. And I think just for the staff and organizers, collaboration, coordination, that could be easily the next topic for a future webinar. Thouraya, would you like the last word before we close out?
Look, it's very difficult to speak after the two interventions that we have. Maybe a couple of things that I would like, again, to emphasize. One, and I think you said it yourself, access to finance is not an end in itself, right? I mean, we're trying to improve access to finance because without finance, you will not be able to buy your inputs so that you can produce, that you can transform, etc. So finance is something that is needed to perform different activities for us to get the food on the table, be it production, transportation, storage, processing, etc., etc. At the same time, I think there are a few things that we need to do. The first one, we need to keep in mind that today there are billions of dollars that are thrown by governments in subsidy programs. So there is already an opportunity to revisit, but are we ready to revisit them? I think Leonard hinted to the issue of governance. So that's also quite important. How open are we to revisit that and also to at least, how to say, bear the first consequences of any reforms, because these are reforms that could be socially extremely difficult. That's one. Second, where would the additional financing come from? Today, we have a situation where most of the developing countries, say, macroeconomic situation has been weakening by COVID. So they have very limited fiscal space to borrow. So either we are willing to provide them with grants because they cannot absorb other things, or we need to look for other channels. One alternative other channel is the private sector. But then it begs us back, is the private sector willing to invest in everything? How can we make the public sector and the private sector work together? Because let's also face it, today you have all these amazing groups of private sector entities that are making declaration of their commitment to do an inclusive and sustainable food system transformation. They at least officially they're claiming that they're willing to make the investments. So how can we use the public sector money to the risk and catalyze this private sector financing? That's, I think, a question that we are all struggling with. The other issue that we need to also tackle is the risk return profile, the segregation. This is a very heterogeneous group. Some of them can take the loans, others need the semi-concessional, others need the grants. Last but not least, there are also some choices to be made. If we promote, for example, the organic fertilizers, the yield could be lower. So what do we do in this case? Do we want to promote food security because we are so concerned about the lack of food on the table? Or should we find an alternative solution that allows us to still promote sustainable practices while also promoting the food security. So again, I think we can sit here and discuss for the entire afternoon. It's a very difficult agenda. Again, coordination is something that everybody's saying, but at the same time, we're seeing a lot of initiative who wants to coordinate, but very little actually concrete coordination happening. So should we maybe, and they always say that if you want to coordinate, we need actually to start with the source of money, meaning the donors. That's why the coordination, you cannot coordinate 13,000 initiatives, but you can coordinate the 5 financiers who are funding everybody. Last but not least, I want to be provocative to what you said. DFIs and donors are working with taxpayers' money. So if we are using taxpayers' money to de-risk taxpayers' money, we do have a problem. And that's why when we tried to launch our private sector financing program, we decided to put it in a niche of high risk tolerance and low return tolerance, because we believe that that's a market that other DFIs are not serving, and that where we really need interventions. Everybody's looking for the double digits and the low return, who's going to serve the high risk market segments. Thank you, over.
Thank you, Thouraya. I think that's a good point to end on. I wish we could continue. I'm getting a message. I need to pass it back, but just that last point. Yes. First of all, I have this argument with our lawyers. They say, I don't want U.S. government money subsidizing U.S. government money. But I think the main point is that the DFIs need to take higher risk, right, and lower returns. So there's a question: should the DFC make a profit? Right now, the DFC. The interesting thing. I'll end with this. I think interesting story. The DFC, it will not be. It's not going to be eliminated, because if you eliminate it, you have to fund it, because they make money for the U.S. government. That so everything else spends money, but they put money back into the treasury. So that's one reason they're considered valuable. But we have to remember that they're a development agency, so they should be focusing on the impact, maybe more than their profit. Great discussion. Thank you, everyone. Lots of challenges that were discussed, and I think it's matched by the passion shown by our panelists. I will, if you have, since we didn't get to go to the Q&A, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and maybe our panelists can just respond to them in the chat. And now I will pass it over to Frank.
Thank you, Songbae, and thank you for moderating a fantastic and a very interesting panel. So we're having a little internal debate because we know that we're a little bit behind in time. I think right now what we're suggesting is, if everyone can deal with this, that we move forward with our last panel,